Hello and welcome back to part 2 of coding a paint application in Scratch. So to start, let's just quickly review what we did last time. We have a working version where we can change the color of our paintbrush and paint the canvas accordingly. Like so. Now, what we plan to do in part 2 is to utilize these save and load buttons to make sure a user can actually save their work and load it when they rerun the program. So let's get started. Now, the first thing we want to do are create a couple of lists. The first list I'm going to create is called the paint list. And make sure to make it for all sprites. Let's make another list, and this time we're going to call it the display list. Once again, make it for all sprites. Now make sure to untick these two options here, as we don't want the player to see them. Alright, great. Now what are these lists going to do? Well, the paint list will essentially be a list of every single pixel. So every single one of these little squares is color value. So we can say 1 for white, 2 for green, 3 for yellow, 4 for red, and so on, or something like that. That way, each pixel will have its own unique number that determines which color it is. The display list will be displayed when the player wants to save their artwork, in which case it'll display a complete connection and concatenation of every single value for each pixel. So for example, if it was all red, and say we assigned red to the value of 2, it would just give us a string of 2s so that we could later load that and understand that every single pixel is 2, so that we should have a complete canvas of red squares. Okay, so let's implement this. The first thing we want to do is create and reset these lists. So this is how we're going to do it. Firstly, let's create the paint list. So when flag clicked, let's delete all of paint list, and then we're going to add 1 to paint list, and this 1 will represent the color white, and the very first value of 1 will represent that the very first pixel is white by default. And then inside these repeat loop where we create clones, we're going to keep adding 1 to paint list, so that by the time all 72 pixels are created, there are 72 ones in the list, each representing the white color. Okay, great. Now, what about when we change the color by selecting a pixel with the mouse? Well, then what we want to do is change the corresponding list value to the correct color. This is how we would do that. Let's say replace item, and then we can say clone number plus 1. So this essentially finds the correct instance of the value. So remember that the original sprite's clone number is 0, so it would be item 1. The first clone would be item 2, the second clone would be item 3, and so on. Let's change this to paint list, and then we can add the current color to it. Okay, great. So next, what we need to do is make sure that this is the case with all the clones. So we can just go ahead and duplicate this and place this block right here. And that's great. That's almost all we need to implement the paint list. So if we go ahead and tick the paint list right here, it'll be visible, and let's run it. And we can see we have a ton of 1s, all representing white. And so when I change the color, we're going to have a couple of 3s. If I go along a row, we'll have a couple of yellows in a row. And then maybe I can do a scramble of reds. And so when we enlarge this list, we can see all the different values that the list has, and that it has exactly 72, which represents the 72 different pixels. Okay, that's great. Now we need to do something with this paint list when we save. So let's go ahead and go into the save button. Alright, now let's code the save button. So the only event we need a code for is when the button is clicked, and if so, we are going to use a variable that we created last time called paint variable. So if you haven't created this, make sure to create it and set it for all sprites. And we want to set this paint variable to item 1 of paint list. And so this will get the very first pixel's color ID and add it to paint variable. Then let's set our counter variable to 2 and repeat for the length of the paint list -1. So the length of the paint list is 72, so this will repeat 71 times for each of the other pixels because we already got the first one. Okay, so what we're going to do is set paint variable to the join of paint variable and item counter of paint list, like so. And then finally inside this loop we need to change counter by 1. So this will loop over every single pixel and it'll get the color ID by getting item counter from paint list, and then it'll add it to paint variable. So at the start, paint variable might be 1, and then it'll get the next one, and that could be 2, and then it'll get the next one, that could be 1 again. So at the end, it'll be a long connection of numbers like 1, 2, 1, 3, 5 that will represent all the colors in this grid. Alright, so now outside of this, let's delete all of display list, and then we want to add paint variable to display list. So the only reason we do it like this is display list is basically just going to display this paint variable that represents this grid's unique color combination. And we display it in a list instead of a variable because lists can take up the entire screen while variables only take up a small section. That's why we do it. Okay. Then finally we make sure to show the list, and then we run a forever loop. Inside this forever loop, we ask the player to paste the code and wait, and then we add an if statement. If the answer is equal to the paint variable, we hide the list and stop this script. So what this does is essentially we run a forever loop and we are asking the player to paste the code that is displayed in display list. And so if they can't, if they paste anything that's not the code, we'll just keep asking them inside this forever loop. But if the answer they give is the paint variable, then we hide the list and stop this script. So what this makes sure of is that the player gets the right code from the display list, and so that they can now then retrieve it with the load button, which we'll get into in a second. We can go to the load button and just add one tiny little script here. So we can say when flag clicked, and we want to just hide the display list and go to, or no, that's all that we need to do. We can just hide the display list, and then we can say when this sprite clicked, we can ask enter code and wait, and then recall of the variable we made last time called load code. If you didn't, make sure to make it for all sprites when you create it. We set the load code to the answer the player gives, and then we broadcast message 1. And we'll code for message 1 in a second, but essentially what this does is when the player clicks load, it means they want to load using a code they've been given. So they paste the code in, and then we set the load code variable to that answer so that we can then use it later. So back in the tile sprite, go ahead and get the when I receive message 1 block. And so when we receive message 1, we're going to use the counter variable once again, but for a different purpose. You can just create an entirely new counter variable here. Just make sure it's for this sprite only. Counter. So let's set counter to 1. And then we can repeat for the length of load code. And then we just say replace place item counter. So this counter is going to help us just count through each pixel. So it'll start at 1 for the first pixel, which is over here, of paint list. Let me zoom out a little bit. Give us some more space. With letter counter of the load code. So to kind of explain this here, load code is going to be 72 characters long, so we take each character and we add it to paint list. And remember to change counter by 1 here. So we loop through each pixel, and then the final piece of code we need is just to switch the costume to the same letter counter of load code. Sorry, no. With item clone number plus 1 of paint list. So we can get clone number plus 1 of paint list. And because we've already imported paint list here and set it, we can retrieve values from it. So let's go ahead and test this all out. So what we can do is just create, our own little landscape. Let's create something nice, maybe some grass and then a blue sky. We can add a sun, and then maybe a little house over here. Alright, great. So now if we save it, we get this pop-up that represents the coloring. And if we copy it and try to write anything else here, like maybe testing, it will not let us go through. It'll loop again, so it'll only go through if we correctly paste the correct code. And then if we rerun the program, click load and enter the code, here we see our painting once again. So yeah, you can retrieve a unique code that represents whatever you've painted and then use that code to load it any other time. And that's what's really cool about this paint application. So I hope you enjoyed this part 2. It was a bit complicated and required quite a bit of logic, but it's definitely worth it for the final result. Thank you, and make sure to like the video and hit the subscribe button. See ya.